Hey guys, it's Libby. Welcome to the Bard Book Club. King Lear is a complicated text. I'm going to start by talking about the manuscript tradition, and then I'm going to spend an unreasonable amount of time on the first line, and then we will go on from there. So there are kind of three versions of King Lear that are read today, and none of those are the versions that were read or performed historically. So Shakespeare's plays, we get most of them from the First Folio, which is a collection of his plays put together by his friends after Shakespeare's death. For some plays, we also have a quarto version. Folio means like fold, so you take a piece of paper and you fold it in half once. Quarto means you fold it into quarters, like that. And for most of Shakespeare's plays, when we have a quarto in addition to the folio version, the two plays are not that different. There'll be a couple of lines that are different or a couple of words. That is not the case with King Lear. The quarto contains about 300 lines that do not appear in the folio, and the folio also contains about 100 lines that do not appear in the quarto. Some lines are also given to different characters, most specifically the final line, which is given to Albany in the quarto and Edgar in the folio. Most people have decided that the play's a lot better if you read it as Edgar getting the last line, so I will be referring to that as the real version of the play. But just so you know, if I talk about a line that you didn't read, you haven't missed something. You're probably just reading a different version. So the Yale edition presents all 400 of the lines that appear in only one version and puts them in brackets so that you know that they only appear in one version. Your edition may be only the quarto text or only the folio text, or a blended version which existed for a while, where editors would decide which lines should be in and which should be out. However, as I said, this is not the version of the play. None of the versions that I've talked about were the version of the play that was performed for a long time. So either the quarto or the folio or something sort of in between is what Shakespeare's troupe would have performed. But in the later 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, everyone was like, this play is a bummer. Everyone dies at the end. It's so sad. So Nahum Tate wrote a new ending where Cordelia does not die and she marries Edgar and they go to be a good king and queen of England. And you know, it's kind of sad, but it's not maximally sad. So if you're reading, say, a book written in the Georgian period and characters talk about going to see King Lear, just know the Lear we know is not the Lear that they are going to see performed. Interestingly about the Nahum Tate version, it may cleave more closely to history. The source for the original Lear story is from Geoffrey of Monmouth's History of the English Kings. Geoffrey of Monmouth was a medieval historian. Lear is largely considered to be a legendary king. Maybe there was a guy named Lear who was king of part or all of England, and perhaps some of the things that Geoffrey of Monmouth describes actually happened, but it's really hard to be sure. In Geoffrey of Monmouth's history, Cordelia and Lear's armies win the battle at the end of the day, and Lear does not die immediately. He and Cordelia reign for another 3 years before he dies peacefully of old age, and Cordelia continues to be like a great English queen or something. But yeah, Shakespeare decided that was not suitable for the type of story that he was telling, so he changed it. So to get a closer look at why he changed it, I want to present to you the first line, and then I will explain to you all of the historical information that is contained within it. So it starts with Kent. I thought the king had more affected the Duke of Albany than Cornwall. So in this first line, we don't know who this guy speaking it is, but we know there were three people. We know there's a king, we know there is a Duke of Albany, and we know that there's a Duke of Cornwall. Lear is another early Jacobean play. A lot of people think it was published in either 1605 or 1606, so 2 or 3 years after James became King of England. And James, before he became King of England, when he was still King of Scotland, made one of his sons the Duke of Albany. And shortly after becoming King of England, he made another of his sons the Duke of Cornwall. So this could basically be a modern line in a modern play and not a play about an ancient English king. And now some more information about Albany and Cornwall. Albany is in Scotland. Cornwall is in the far southwest of England, and it's not contiguous with Wales, but it does have a lot of cultural and linguistic similarities with Wales. Both of the regions are so far west that they didn't have a lot of influence from the Anglo-Saxon and then Viking invasions, so they retained a more Celtic identity. People in Wales were largely still speaking Welsh. People in Cornwall were also often speaking Cornish as their native language, and Cornish is a language that is much more closely related to Welsh than to any other language that is spoken on the British Isles. And so we start with this idea of there being some sort of distinct places on the island of Great Britain, and then this is formalized later in the first scene when Lear announces that he is dividing up the kingdom. And part of it is going to go to Cornwall and Regan, part of it is going to go to Goneril and Albany, and part of it is supposed to go to Cordelia. So the Shakespearean audience would assume that Scotland is going to Albany, Wales and Cornwall are going to Cornwall, and England is going to Cordelia. This is a bit of Lear showing his favoritism, which he's not very subtle about, because England is much larger than the other two regions of Great Britain, and also this is being performed for English people who probably think that England is, maybe the tiniest bit better than the other two regions. And what Lear is doing by dividing the kingdom is exactly the opposite of what James was doing by uniting the kingdoms. England and Wales had already been unified for quite a while, but James was trying to unify England and Scotland. He was king of both, and it's a lot easier to govern them as one collective unit, and it would also mean that there wouldn't be difficulties with succession. If he has two separate kingdoms, perhaps it would be expected that one kingdom would go to one son and the other kingdom would go to another son, and this could cause problems. So I think by writing a play where the division of Great Britain leads to great tragedy is kind of Shakespeare sucking up to the new king. It seems like Queen Elizabeth was a big fan of Shakespeare, and he just kind of lucked into this. She just kind of liked the plays that he wrote, and so he was a little bit nervous maybe when his old fan departed this plane, and there's a new monarch who he really wants to make sure likes him. So we see some sort of sucking up to James in this, and we also get that in Macbeth, which is about witches. James was very interested in witches. He wrote a book about them, and also the line that becomes the kings of Scotland in Macbeth is supposedly the ancestors of James. In Act 1, Scene 2, Shakespeare also brings this story of an ancient king into the modern day with Gloucester's speech around line 105. This is quite a prosy play, so our line numbers may differ, but Gloucester says, "These late eclipses in the sun and moon portend no good to us. Though the wisdom of nature can reason it thus and thus, yet nature finds itself scourged by the sequent effects. Love cools, friendship falls off, brothers divide. In cities, mutinies, in countries, discord, in palaces, treason, and the bond cracked twixt son and father." The late eclipses of the sun and moon are probably referring to the solar and lunar eclipse that happened in the year 1605. And the in palaces treason reference may be referring to the gunpowder plot where Guy Fawkes attempted to explode Parliament while James was there, also in 1605. So now that we have the historical context, we can focus a bit more on the play itself, which is actually really hard, I think. There is quite possibly more that can be said about this play than about any other of Shakespeare's plays. It's basically two full plays by themselves. The Lear plot or the Gloucester plot could both stand on their own with only a very minor subplot to break up the scenes, but instead we get all of them. When I was reading it this time, I was struck by how much happens in Act 1. In Act 1, we get rid of Cordelia and Kent, and then we also get rid of Goneril. So by the beginning of Act 2, Lear's down to one daughter who likes him. And it feels like every scene in this play is working on about 9 different levels at once. And it's also very fractal. So there's a lot of self-reference, a lot of key words that are repeated again and again throughout the play, like nothing, fool, references to eyesight, nature. There's another big one. And I feel like there are also several moments of distillment where one scene or one speech or Shakespeare's feeling really ambitious, one line will sort of encapsulate the entire play. Take a look at what the Fool says in Act 1, Scene 4, around line 185. They'll have me whipped for speaking true, thou'lt have me whipped for lying, and sometimes I am whipped for holding my peace. Sort of any speech utterance that you make will get you in trouble. So someone who is punished for speaking true, that's Kent. People who are punished for lying, Regan and Goneril, not punished perhaps by another person, but punished by the play, or punished by each other. And sometimes I'm whipped for holding my peace, Cordelia, who says she will say nothing. So because this is such a beautiful tangle of a play, I can't really talk about it the way I talk about the other plays. I can't be like, well, you know, with Measure for Measure, here is this allegory and this is, you know, the one-to-one correspondence that everything has. The good news is that I think the play largely speaks for itself. So I want to sort of introduce you to some ideas and some connections that you can make. And then we will take a look at how that works in particular sections of the text. And then for the rest of it, even if you just read the play to prepare for this video, maybe go read it again. And I think you will notice things that I don't mention, because it's all very interconnected. So first, I want to talk about the incredible resonance between the characters. In King Lear, we don't really have like the classic foiling situation where we have like a main character and then one character who is, you know, obviously meant to represent the opposite of our main character. You know, everyone is sort of representing an element of oppositeness in everybody else. So characters that you can compare. Obviously, the first one you're going to notice is Lear and Gloucester. Some differences between them. Lear, they're both deceived by their children. However, Lear sort of allows himself to be deceived more. We, the audience, feel that it should be obvious that Regan and Goneril are lying when they say how much they love their father. But Lear, even though he is presented with the same evidence as the audience, does not believe them. Gloucester, on the other hand, doesn't have the same set of information as the audience. We get to see Edmund by himself, telling us about his plot, and then Gloucester only gets to see what Edmund decides to show him. Then Lear is choosing to resign his powers, where Gloucester is taking these actions against his son Edgar because he wants to retain his powers. Lear is also treated badly when he is a guest. He is turned out of the home of, well, it's Gloucester's home, but he's turned out by Cornwall and Regan, and he feels that he is being dismissed by Goneril, where Gloucester's most severe mistreatment is when he is a host and he is being abused by his guests. Similarities between them, I think we're not really supposed to like them at the beginning. We're supposed to think that Lear is an idiot for, you know, divesting himself of his kingship in this way. And, you know, maybe that's not the worst idea, but thinking that he can do this and then still retain all of these rights of kingship, that's just not very bright. And then, of course, we see him be obviously deceived by the bad girls and not appreciate the good girl and the good man, Kent. Gloucester, meanwhile, I think modern productions are diverging slightly from the text and the original interpretation of Gloucester. He's often presented as like a pretty nice guy at the beginning who just like gets tricked, oops. But I think a Shakespearean audience would have received him as kind of a lech, like talking about all of the fun he had shagging his mistress when he begot Edmund. That is just about the only place in the play where sex is talked about as a good thing. Throughout most of the play, sex is a bad thing, either in and of itself or in its results. Okay, I won't talk that much about all of the character pairings because there's a lot of them. But then we've got Lear and Edgar, who are both forced out onto the heath in this wild night and become sort of like wild men, Edgar in pretend, but Lear in reality. You'll see a lot of cases where something is figurative for one character and literal for another character. Here it's pretend for one character and real for another character, which is the same sort of thing that you will see in Hamlet, where Hamlet pretends to be insane and Ophelia actually goes insane. Here, Edgar pretends to be maybe not insane, but a bit wacky, and Lear actually goes mad. Then we've got Lear and the Fool. The Fool takes great pains to point Lear out as a fool based on the actions he has taken as regards his daughters. Anyone else with Lear? Okay, those are the main ones. Then we've got France and Burgundy, who only show up for one scene, but they are a very clear, classic foiling pair. So you've got the one guy who he's a nice guy, the Duke of Burgundy I'm referring to. He doesn't wish Cordelia ill, but he is just marrying her for the money. And so if she doesn't have any money and land, he's not interested. And then the King of France is not interested in her for her financial merit, but for her virtue, for her in and of herself. This is where we bring in the dialogue of, or the dialectic of city comedy, which is very interested in worth, commodity, value, especially the value of women, as we saw a lot in Measure for Measure. Now I want to talk about Edmund and Cordelia. You might not expect these two to be compared because Cordelia is the good child and Edmund is the bad child, but the thing that connects them is that they are both the younger child. Edmund says he is some 12 or 14 moonshines lag of a brother, so he is the younger one, and so it's interesting that in one case the younger one is the good one, and in the other case the younger one is the bad one. And so I think a lot of people are tempted to sort of compare Edgar and Cordelia. I think Edgar's arc is more interestingly contrasted with Kent's, because Cordelia leaves. She leaves England for most of the play. Edgar and Kent are both exiled, and they are supposed to leave, but they remain in disguise and are very nice, very helpful to the people who had caused their exile, their father and their king. Cordelia and the Fool is also another popular point of comparison. A lot of people think that these roles were meant to be played by the same actor, because when Cordelia leaves for France, that's when the Fool joins the play, and then the Fool just sort of oddly disappears in Act 3, and then Cordelia reappears in Act 4. I've seen different ways of handling this. I've seen Lear on stage 3 times and on film twice. One was a literal filmed production of a stage version, the fairly recent one with Simon Russell Beale at the National Theatre in London, and then also an older one with Ian Holm, aka Bilbo Baggins, which was originally done as a stage production, but when they filmed it, they adapted the staging a little bit for an actual soundstage. And in some cases, they will just let the Fool disappear. In the Ian McKellen version at the Royal Shakespeare Theatre in Stratford, the Fool, you see the hanging of the Fool after the storm scene, or at the end of Act 3. Some people, presumably from Edmund or Cornwall's forces, grab him and hang him. And in the Simon Russell Beale version, Lear himself kills the Fool as part of his madness during the pseudo-trial scene when he's putting Goneril, who's a chair, and Regan, who's, I don't remember, a broom or something, on trial. And sort of when he's yelling at Goneril, he thinks the Fool is Goneril and kills him. And there's also that very enigmatic line that Lear issues in the final scene where he says, "My poor Fool's hanged." We know that Cordelia was hanged and he's holding her, so he could be referring to her as the Fool, which he has done and other characters have done throughout the play, but he also could be referring to the character of the Fool. The Fool is also sort of extra archetypal in this play, and also extra important. I think he has more lines than the typical Shakespearean fool, but he also doesn't have a name. A lot of other Shakespearean fools do get names, so like Feste in Twelfth Night, Lavache in All's Well That Ends Well, Touchstone in As You Like It, but this fool is only referred to as Lear's fool. Then just to address the obvious character counterings, Edgar and Edmund, and Regan/Goneril and Cordelia. Although I think the contrast between Goneril and Regan is also an interesting one. And I have seen productions where these two characters are kind of conflated, and it's like they have the same types of interaction with their father. They might as well just be one person. However, I think that is a failure of interpretation of the text, because if you actually look at the words that they say, they react very differently to their father. They clearly have different types of relationships with him. So I do want to get into looking at the differences between them in the text, but just a couple more notes on those like key words that I mentioned for this play, particularly on nothing, and I don't remember what the other one is that I want to talk about right now, but I will certainly get to it. Nothing, remember, in Shakespearean English, in early modern English, is also slang for vagina, so keep that in mind. Anytime someone says that, see if you can infer a double meaning from that. At some point, Lear says, "Nothing will come from nothing" to Cordelia, and then later he will curse Goneril's womb and make her infertile, or want to make her infertile, which will result in nothing coming from nothing. Yes, and the other one is natural. So nature has a variety of different meanings in this play, and also in modern English. One that you may not be familiar with is the term a natural son or a natural child, which means an illegitimate child. So a child conceived in the natural way as opposed to in the legal way. And this is why Edmund adopts nature as his goddess. So we've got the idea of a natural child, we've got nature outside, specifically in this play with the weather, when we have the storm, and then there's nature, a person's nature, sort of a person's character. And then one thing that would probably help my appreciation of the play if I was able to like fully wrap my head around the early modern conception of it, and that is the natural love. So Cordelia refers to the natural love between a parent and child as being the kind of love that she has, and that this is real. She actually has it, whereas her sisters do not have this natural love, and they are therefore unnatural. I will confess that I actually have a hard time reconciling the relationship between Lear and Cordelia that we see in Act 1 with the relationship that we see in Acts 4 and 5, because it reads as so different to me, that's really like a point where the play falls down for me. However, even though that point, however significant it is to the story, there's so much else about this play that is good that I still think, even if that is in fact irreconcilable, this is still a really, really good play. Okay, so I want to look at the speeches of the daughters, the 3 speeches. Some people may tell you there are only 2, but Cordelia does in fact make a speech. So if you count the lines, Cordelia does talk the most. She does make the longest speech. Goneril, her speech is I think 7 lines. Regan's is 8. Cordelia has 9 lines, starting with "Good my lord, you have begot me, bred me, loved me." But she also has 3 lines before that, where she says, "Unhappy that I am, I cannot heave my heart into my mouth. I love your majesty according to my bond, no more, no less." So she's got 12 lines of sort of describing her love about her father. So when she says she will say nothing, that is not actually true. Now, she does probably intend to say nothing, but then she is forced to explain what she means by that, which is what her speeches are more about. So this nothing that she's not saying that she doesn't love her father. She's saying that her love for her father is not expressible in speech because it is the natural bond, and so it is like a thing of nature, which is a non-human sort of thing, and then speech is a human-created sort of thing, and so these two cannot work together. You cannot express natural love in human words. Then I want to skip to the end of Act 1, Scene 1, where we have Goneril and Regan alone on the stage. First of all, notice that we are switching from couplets into prose, so not just any old verse, but rhyming couplets. Cordelia's great line, "Time shall unfold what plighted cunning hides, who covers faults at last, shame them derides." And so what I want to do is first read all of Goneril's lines from this scene, and then read all of Regan's lines from this scene, but they are alternating. So Goneril starts, "Sister, it is not a little I have to say of what most nearly appertains to us both. I think our father will hence tonight. You see how full of changes his age is. The observation we have made of it hath not been little. He always loved our sister most, and with what poor judgment he hath now cast her off appears too grossly. The best and soundest of his time hath been but rash. Then must we look from his age to receive not alone the imperfections of long engraft condition, but therewithal the unruly waywardness that infirm and choleric years bring with them. There is a further compliment of leave-taking between France and him. Pray you, let us sit together. If our father carry authority with such disposition as he bears, this last surrender of his will but offend us. We must do something, and in the heat." Then in that scene, Regan says, "That's most certain, and with you, next month with us. 'Tis the infirmity of his age, yet hath he ever but slenderly known himself. Such unconstant starts are we like to have from him as this of Kent's banishment. We shall think further of it." So two things you should notice. One, Goneril says a lot more words. Also, she uses much longer sentences. Regan is also frequently not even using complete sentences. And then at the end, she's rather dismissive. She says, "We shall think further of it." Goneril says, "We must do something in the heat. We don't have time to think about it." So I tend to read Regan as either not taking her father really seriously. Goneril is expressing her concerns about what all of the bad things that are going to happen to them because of what went on in the previous scene. But Regan's like, whatever, it's not really going to be a problem. And then either this is because she doesn't take her father seriously, or because it's not going to be a problem for her for the next month, because her dad's spending a month with Goneril, and so Regan's got 30 whole days to not have to worry about this. Goneril on the other hand, I just want to apologize right now if I mix up any of the siblings' names, particularly Edgar and Edmund. I mean, that's just unfair. Or if I call either of them Edward, I apologize. Goneril is really concerned about this. She has to deal with her dad first, but as we'll see later, she also seems to have a different relationship with him than Regan. Seems to really actively dislike Goneril. And so this sort of makes sense that Cordelia is his favorite, Goneril, the firstborn, his least favorite, Regan in the middle. So he's not really dividing them into older two, younger two, but there's a continuum between how much he likes them. Then the girls exit and we see Edmund again, and he delivers just it's such a great speech. "Thou, nature, art my goddess." And it's very charismatic. Edmund is one of those classic charismatic Shakespearean villains like Iago, Aaron, and Richard III. This is a really great speech to perform. If you're an actor, you add this monologue to your repertory. You've got lines like, "Why brand they us with base, with baseness, bastardy, base who in the lusty stealth of nature take more composition and fierce quality than doth with a dull, stale, tired bed go to the creating a whole tribe of fops got tween asleep and wake." What a great speech. So Edmund, he's detestable in what he does, but you also kind of want to like him, don't you? Yeah, we kind of want to like him. He will actually talk to us, the audience. Most characters in this play don't do that. In the second half of the play, we get Edgar talking to us more. He soliloquizes about what he's seeing and the suffering that he is experiencing. So let's jump forward to some of his speeches. So in Act 4, Scene 1, Edgar enters by himself and says to the audience, "Yet better thus, and known to be condemned, than still condemned and flattered. To be worst, the lowest and most dejected thing of fortune, stands still in esperance, lives not in fear. The lamentable change is from the best, the worst returns to laughter. Welcome then, thou unsubstantial air that I embrace. The wretch that thou hast blown unto the worst owes nothing to thy blasts, but who comes here. Then he sees his father, he sees him for the first time, blinded and being led by an old servant. And I'm going to try not to cry. And then he says, O God, who can say, I am the worst, I am worse than e'er I was, and worse I may yet be. The worst is not, so long as we can say, this is the worst. These two passages are not as charismatic as what Edmund speaks, but he is very well spoken. This is like a well-structured piece of rhetoric. We do get a little reference to the line, thou nature art my goddess, with welcome then, thou unsubstantial air that I embrace. A little bit of similarities in there. And you might complain that in the second section, he uses the word worst too much. I am the worst, I am worse than e'er I was, and worse I may yet be. The worst is not, this is the worst. But he says in that final line, the worst is not so long as we can say this is the worst. So the fact that he is saying worst over and over and over again is him reinforcing the idea that this is not as worse, as bad as it can possibly get. And of course, his references to the impossibility of speech echo Cordelia's references to the impossibility of speech when it comes to expressing her love. He talks about the impossibility of speech when it comes to expressing your degradation, the badness of your state. If you are physically able to say, this is the worst, then you are wrong, because you could always be rendered into a state where you are not able to say that. Now, coming back to the differences between Regan and Goneril, I want to take a look at Act 1, Scene 4, when Goneril complains of the treatment of her servants by Lear and his knights. Before we get to that, though, some productions, the director has a bit of leeway in who he wants to create more sympathy for with how he handles the knights. So in some productions, they make it so that Regan and Goneril are lying about how ill-behaved they are, and they're just looking for an excuse to get rid of their father. So they will have, like, not 100 knights, but like a couple, and they're, polite and not making a mess of things and, like, raping the servants. And in other productions, they, like, lean into what Regan and Goneril are saying by having them be incredibly rowdy and aggressive. I think Shakespeare absolutely intended them to be read as rowdy and aggressive, because, there were not 100 people in Shakespeare's company to play all of these knights. I don't think there were even 30 people in Shakespeare's company, and also you can't fit 100 people on the globe or on, another Jacobean stage. And Shakespearean audiences are very used to having things told to them, to having pictures created through the poetry. Obviously, we can think of the chorus in Henry V creating these pictures of giant battlefields. And so when Regan and Goneril are saying how abusive the knights are, since there is nothing else in the text to tell us that it's not actually that bad, the audience would believe that it is that bad. So if there's something that's impossible to be shown on stage and we are told about it, we need to believe the telling unless there's something else in the text that contradicts it. So I'm going to read Goneril's speech from Act 1, Scene 4, around 205, and the meter is a really interesting part of this, and since the modern ear is not as attuned to meter as the Shakespearean ear, I am going to do a really noticeable breath anytime there's a comma, and an even bigger breath anytime there's a period or a semicolon. Not only, sir, this your all-licensed fool, but others of your insolent retinue do hourly carp and quarrel, breaking forth in rank and not to be endured riots. Sir, I had thought by making this well known unto you to have found a safe redress, but now grow fearful by what you yourself too late have spoken done, that you protect this course and put it on by your allowance, which if you should, the fault would not scape censure, nor the redresses sleep, which in the tender of a wholesome weal might in their working do you that offense, which else were shame, that the necessity will call discreet proceeding. So we're kind of bordering on word salad. The phrases don't really lead into each other with like grammatical logic, and since the meter is so off, at one point, there's sir is just a word in its own line. This means she's very emotional, and I think the emotion she's expressing here is fear. She doesn't really want to be bringing this up, and so she wants to really quickly get through this speech. She wants him to just say yes to her demands to get rid of half of his retinue, but so she needs to present enough arguments in her initial speech so that she doesn't have to like continue having this conversation that she really doesn't want to have, but she's having a lot of difficulty doing that because she's afraid of her father and she's also afraid of the knights. This play can also be interpreted very differently based on the stature of the man playing King Lear. So Ian McKellen, obviously quite tall and imposing when he wants to be. His King Lear is necessarily different, and the other characters' reactions to his Lear are necessarily different than Simon Russell Beale, who is quite short and a bit of a teddy bear, as well as Ian Holm, who's also quite short, not quite as much of a teddy bear. And so if you want to make your Lear menacing, you need to figure out where his menace lies, which is going to depend on your actor. And then in the way that Lear responds to this speech, you can see the difference between how he thinks of Goneril and how he thinks of Regan. And I do think it's more interesting to have a play where you have one father-daughter relationship where they both love each other, one where they both dislike each other, and then one where Lear loves Regan, but Regan does not love Lear. So with Goneril, she makes this one complaint, and he immediately jumps to, "Are you our daughter?" And he will multiple times throughout the play like repudiate her as his. So he starts with that, and the scene ends up with the nature here, dear goddess here, suspend thy purpose, if thou didst intend to make this creature fruitful, into her womb convey sterility, dry up her organs of increase, and from her derogate body never spring a babe to honor her. Yikes, that's intense. And it also says something about the intended casting of Goneril and therefore Regan. These are really great roles that every actress wants to play, and it's often given to really famous actors in their 40s, 50s, sometimes 60s. However, I think this doesn't really work, and I think if you have a Goneril who's older than 30, this scene is ineffective, because if you have like a 50-year-old Goneril, it's kind of like, I think that ship has sailed. This, the situation with her organs of increase, I don't think that's going to matter at this point. So I do read Goneril and Regan as fairly young, and I also kind of read them in the first scene as having just gotten married. So, we've dealt with 2 weddings, and now we're about to deal with the 3rd wedding of Cordelia in the first scene. And also it would make sense, right at the marriage to have Lear deal with the dowries. And also, since Lear doesn't think super highly of women, now he has sons who can govern the land because he doesn't want women governing the land. And so, it makes sense that right after the marriage is when he would divide up his kingdom. So, in my production of King Lear, I might have Goneril and Regan enter in their wedding dresses and then just have this be worst wedding ever. I have to explain to my dad how much I love him. Ugh. In Act 2, Scene 1, we have a good pun on one of our keywords. Here it's natural, so around line 85, Gloucester, who at this point is trusting Edmund, calls him loyal and natural boy. Natural, here he's using it to mean experiencing the natural love, the natural filial love, whereas before he has been using it to mean illegitimate. So moving on to Act 2, Scene 4, we get our first time of seeing Lear and Regan interact without the other two sisters there. Lear finds Kent, who he believes is Caius, put in the stocks. Cornwall, Regan, Gloucester, and servants enter. When Lear first sees Regan, he says, "Regan, I think you are. I know what reason I have to think so. If thou shouldst not be glad, I would divorce me from thy mother's tomb, sepulchring an adulteress. O are you free?" To Kent, some other time for that. "Beloved Regan, thy sister's not. O Regan, she hath tied sharp-toothed unkindness like a vulture here." He points to his heart and says, I can scarce speak to thee. Thou'lt not believe of how depraved a quality, O Regan. Here, of course, we're seeing the inability of speech to express what we feel. And Regan responds to this with, "I pray you, sir, take patience. I have hope you less know how to value her desert than she to scant her duty." So here we have a bit of a reversal of the relationship that we saw with Goneril and Lear. So Goneril was coming to her father with complaints, and he was like, "This is not a problem, get out of my face." And now Lear is coming to Regan with complaints about Goneril, and Regan is just like, "No, it's not a problem. Go away. I don't have to deal with you right now." She's also much more willing to tread the line of insulting. Goneril tends to be careful to be polite in her speech, at least at the beginning. Regan just comes out and says, "Sir, you are old. Nature in you stands on the very verge of her confine. You should be ruled and led by some discretion that discerns your state better than yourself." Ouch. And then I very briefly want to reference one of the most famous speeches that Lear has in this play, because we will stick a pin in it and examine it a little bit later in the context of another speech. So it opens, "O reason not the need, our basest beggars are in the poorest thing superfluous. Allow not nature more than nature needs, man's life is cheap as beasts." So then Lear is not allowed into Gloucester's house, which has kind of been taken over by Cornwall and Regan. Cornwall appears to be a sort of patron to Gloucester, and that's why he is able to take these liberties, and Gloucester is still polite about it, up until he actually sticks his boot in his eye. So we've got the big famous blow winds and crack your cheeks scene. This is just some good poetry, and it's not working on 9 different levels, so I'll let you enjoy that for yourself. But at the end of that little micro scene that he has with the fool right before Kent enters, Lear says, "No, I will be the pattern of all patience. I will say nothing." It's exactly what Cordelia said at the beginning. Then that little speech that he has that I want to compare to Reason Not the Need, it's Act 3, Scene 4. He's standing right outside Edgar, disguised as poor Tom's hovel. He's alone on stage, and he says, "Poor naked wretches, wheresoe'er you are, that bide the pelting of this pitiless storm, how shall your houseless heads and unfed sides, your looped and windowed raggedness defend you from such seasons as these? Oh, I have ta'en too little care of this. Take physic, pomp, expose thyself to feel what wretches feel, that thou mayst shake the superflux to them, and show the heavens more just." So we have the word superfluity connecting the two speeches. And originally, Lear, still very much a king expecting to have things granted to him, is saying, even the poorest peasant is rich in something. And here he's like, "No, it's actually just really bad." I want to talk briefly about the staging of the stripping scene. So Lear is stripped figuratively and literally throughout the first 3 acts. First, he strips himself of his crown. He also strips himself of his loyal friends, Cordelia and Kent. And it's because he did this foolish stripping that he exposes himself to other types of stripping. So his daughters strip him of his retinue, sort of piece by piece, which is more reminiscent of removing clothing, which is done piece by piece, not, at least in the 16th and 17th centuries. And then when he's on the heath and he sees Edgar wearing basically nothing. Edgar, before he puts on his disguise, says, "I'll gird my loins," so he's not totally naked. Lear sees Edmund's condition and is kind of impressed by Edgar, I told you I would do this. He sees Edgar's condition as sort of like impressed by the utter humanness of him, with like no accoutrement, and he wants to emulate this, so he the stage direction, which was added by an editor, says tearing off his clothes. The lines that Lear speaks are off, you lendings, come unbutton here. In modern productions, it's often like a big deal about whether or not the actor is going to get totally nude on stage. I would like to point out that I really do not think that in 1605 a man got totally nude on a stage in London. For one reason, it would take a really long time to take off all of your clothes. You've got a doublet, and then your hose, which are often sort of complicatedly attached either to a doublet or a jerkin, and then probably drawers or brays under that, and a shirt. So, minimum 4 garments, at least one of which is going to have lots of buttons or ties, and it would just kill the pacing. And the Jacobeans were more comfortable with their bodies and other people's bodies than our current culture is. But I think, complete nudity maybe would have been a bit too much for them. And now, since we've done the storm scene, that means we are coming to the eye gouging scene. This is probably the most violent act Shakespeare portrays outside of Titus Andronicus. And Titus Andronicus's approach to violence is very, campy. It's so much that you're not supposed to take it seriously. Whereas in King Lear, there's really just this one act of violence. I mean, there's some, murdery stuff on stage at the very end of the play. But when Shakespeare kills a character, he usually just kills them cleanly with a sword or sometimes poison. You don't get a lot of torture, and this is a torture scene. And so I've been in audiences for both Lear and Titus Andronicus, and the violence in Titus Andronicus, the audience is often like, blah, whoa, gross. In the eye gouging scene, the audience is silent, and most people can't look at it. This scene also gives us a really great bit part. There's several really good bit parts for servants in King Lear, and that's when Cornwall has put out one of Gloucester's eyes. A servant says, "Hold your hand, my lord, I have served you ever since I was a child, but better service I have never done you than now to bid you hold." So this character is also kind of a reflection of Cordelia, or of Kent, who he's saying, I served you ever since I was a child, so he's sort of casting Cornwall in a father-like role, and he's, the child who is speaking truth and trying to prevent his father from doing a horrible, stupid thing. And, we know what happens to characters who speak truth to power in this play. They die, so Cornwall kills him. That was also fatally wounded. And then Gloucester, when he is fully blind, he immediately calls out to Edmund. He says, "All dark and comfortless, where's my son Edmund? Edmund, and kindle all the sparks of nature to quit this horrid act." And Regan responds, "Out, treacherous villain, thou call'st on him that hates thee. It was he that made the overture of thy treasons to us, who is too good to pity thee." And Gloucester says, "Oh, my follies, then, Edgar was abused. Kind gods, forgive me that, and prosper him." And so we have this sort of classically poignant story element where the instant that he becomes physically blind is when he stops being figuratively blind, and he learns which of his sons was the good one. This play's a bummer, guys. It's a real bummer. Oh yeah, and then my next note is just a line that is so good that when it is said, I basically just want the play to stop for 10 minutes so that I can think about it. It's when Gloucester, he's about to encounter Edgar. Edgar is watching this scene, and Gloucester is being led by the old man, who says, when Gloucester tells him to leave, You cannot see your way. And Gloucester says, I have no way and therefore want no eyes. I stumbled when I saw. Oh my God, that's so good. I do briefly want to talk about Lear's misogyny. I talked about how he seems unwilling to give his kingdom to his daughters, and he waits until he has sons to give it to, sons-in-law. He also, when he starts crying, is mad at himself for using women's weapons. I'm not sure if this is exactly how an early modern English person would conceptualize gender, but this is how I conceptualize them conceptualizing it. And I don't know if it will be helpful for you, but I'll do my best. So, like, a man is this sort of upright form of human, and then anything else is a decline away from it. So you can decline away from it by being a child, by being female, by being not masculine in some way, and these ways often manifest when you are old. And so Lear is really, first of all, he's upset, and then he's made doubly upset by the fact that he is crying like a woman. More about crying when we get to Coriolanus, and more about hating women when we get to Coriolanus. But he also says during the sort of mock trial scene, behold yond simpering dame, whose face between her forks presages snow, that minces virtue and does shake the head to hear of pleasure's name. The fichu nor the soiled horse goes to it with more riotous appetite. Down from the waist they are all centaurs, though women all above. But to the girdle do the gods inherit. Beneath is all the fiends. There's hell, there's darkness, there is the sulphurous pit, burning, scalding, stench, consumption. Fie, 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 pa, pa, give me an ounce of civet good apothecary to sweeten my imagination. That is just a really fancy way of saying women are hyper lustful, and also vaginas are disgusting. You also get a bit of this from Edgar in Act 3, Scene 4. He says, talking about when his brother was conceived, that his father did the act of darkness with her, the act of darkness being a not very flattering word for sex. And then in the final scene, when he reveals himself to his brother, who is now dying, he says, the dark and vicious place where he got cost him his eyes, referring to the place where he conceived Edmund as being a dark and vicious place, which you can read either as the location where the sex occurred or as the actual vagina. Before we get to the very end, a last thing I want to point out is that Lear is very difficult to relate to. He's a king. Most of us are not a king. He does something that most people find very stupid in the first scene, and he's very old. And most people are not very old, nor can they remember it due to the direction that memory works. So I think it's easier for an old person to relate to a young person because they were young once, but it's harder for a young person to relate to an old person because they've never been old. And so there's all of these things standing between us and understanding Lear, but instead we have Edmund understanding Lear with the soliloquies that and the asides that he increasingly has as he witnesses his father's blindness and Lear's madness. And Edgar, as I mentioned, is a much more easy to relate to character because of the interaction that he has with the audience with his soliloquies, which, though they are not as charismatic as his brothers, are still very well written. So now I just want to talk about the last 6 lines real fast. I've gotten real sad while filming this video a couple of times. Normally when I'm watching it, I'm totally fine until the last 6 lines, which are just something else. And the image that we create at the very end of the play is the reverse of the image created at the beginning of the play. So originally Lear was dividing his kingdom into 3 pieces. At the very end, we're left with 3 people to inherit the throne: Albany, Kent, and Edgar, who is now presumably Duke of Gloucester. But we end up with the crown being reformed. Albany says, I don't want to be the king, guys. You can share it between you. And then Kent says, I have a journey, sir, shortly to go. My master calls me up. I have a journey, sir, shortly to go. My master calls me. I must not say no. So, he's going to kill himself. He does not want to partake in the throne. And so we are left just with Edgar, who delivers the last 4 lines, which are so good, but which I cannot read to you right now because it is too sad, so you go read them yourself. Wow, this took a long time to film. Next month, Comedy of Errors. Should be much shorter, much happier. It's an early farce. I will not cry during the video. Okay, I'll see you later, guys. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you go reread King Lear with all of this in mind.